I get to address lots of crowds in various places, but this is my first time getting to speak at home, and it's so amazing to see all these familiar faces in the crowd. So thanks for joining me and everyone else on this journey. It's really special tonight. So my question for all of you today is, if not you, then who? And by that I mean, who else but all of you are better suited to challenging the status quo, to not just smashing ceilings, but making new ones? Who but all of the young people in today's audience are better suited to being the future leaders of our communities? And who, if not all of you, are better equipped to challenging inherent inequalities and challenging bias? I read an excerpt the other day written by the mayor of Calgary, and I think it applies to the young people here very well. You all share in this extraordinary good fortune. You live in Canada, in a community that has a stake in you, wants you to do well, and will not let you stumble. You're here tonight because your community wants you to be your personal best. That's empowering. You can do whatever you want. But the flip side of this gift of choice is the paradox of choice. At 16, I had no idea what I wanted to pursue. I mean, like, navigating the velocity of high school was hard enough, let alone trying to do something impactful and significant. I mean, like so many of you, I wanted to do something meaningful, but I had no idea, what that could look like. And interestingly enough, so many of the issues that are on the forefront of today's society weren't discussed when I was in high school. And that means a lot of the jobs that are around now didn't exist back then. Things like the ethics of artificial intelligence, having a minister of climate change, gender-neutral language, even things like bloggers. I mean, that didn't exist back then. They just hadn't found expression yet. And so if you told me some 20 years ago that I'd be leading global engineering humanitarian projects, I wouldn't have had the faintest idea what that meant. And I mean, that's in no small part because, Teen Beat magazine was telling me that having perpetually glossy lips was more important than making technology that was going to save millions of people. But globalization just wasn't part of mainstream dialogue back then. But my first, if not you, but who moment came when I was, around that age. I think I was in my early teens, and I was visiting family in India. And I had just put these blonde streaks that I have 20 years later in my hair. My parents were apoplectic because I had ruined my beautiful East Indian locks. And I wanted to change my hair color because all of my peers and classmates had strawberry blonde or red or brown hair that would change color in the summertime. And I had static, monochrome East Indian black hair that would not change. So I put these streaks in my hair, and I'm bounding down the streets of Mumbai. And I see this girl, and she's got the exact same hair as me, and I'm like, yeah! And then I go to turn her around. I'm about to tap her, and then she turns around by herself, and I realize she's got blonde hair because she's malnourished. She's a beggar. And while I don't know what went through my 14-year-old mind, I know that it was my first understanding of inequality. She had achieved her look through poverty, and I had achieved mine through privilege. It shamed my moral sense. And that same shame came over me a couple years later when I was in high school, and I came across the book The Outsiders by S.E. Hinton, which you may have heard about because it's been made into a major motion picture. And it's about teenage, high school age male rival gangs. Now, the tone of the novel persuades one to believe that it's written by a male. So imagine my surprise when I realized that S.E. Hinton is Susan Eloise Hinton, and that she'd written under her initials so it wouldn't be dismissed by the male reviewers. This was baffling to me because so many of the great authors and writers that I know are female, and that's when it hit me. The idea of being committed to a world where women can be who they are, which means being committed to the idea of who you are. Being a girl is a strength in itself. Just the everyday battles that girls overcome to achieve what they deserve, whether it be education, work, or simply respect. It's a testament to their remarkability. The one thing exceptional women that I know have in common is that they have to fight for the right to assert themselves. By being a woman, you have in you the very ability to transcend barriers, shatter limitations, and pave the way for others to do the same. You have the ability to use your life to be a light in the life of others. So 15 years ago, I asked myself the question, where do the greatest barriers still exist for women? The obvious answer, engineering. It's an area of obvious male province. So my reasons for picking engineering weren't because I was some whiz kid who could make a Jeep with a Swiss Army knife. I really just did it because it was a gender bender. But interestingly enough, it was through my work that I learned that engineering could alleviate human suffering and that technology can have its pulse, can have its finger on the pulse of humanity's well-being. I learned that you could combine discipline with love and empathy with technique. My work has brought me to some of the most conflicted zones of the world, and I've witnessed some of the most inhumane situations that you could possibly imagine. Unfairness and inequality that run so rampant that they can't be ignored once you witness them. The brain, once it's stretched to a certain dimension, it can never go back. And it's from these experiences that I became convinced that each of us have a duty to fight willing indifference, to confront bias, and to always make sure that what we're doing contributes to positive social change. Now, I get asked this question a lot by a lot of people of all genders, of all ages. And they go, well, what should I do? Where do I start? There's so many issues, there's so many problems. What can I do? I'm just one person. And I see people, young and old, with skills, passion, vision, experience, desire, and they get lost on this question. And my answer to that is, anything that strikes you as intrinsically wrong, anything that makes your core temperature rise, anything where you get beside yourself, that it's even allowed to occur, that it's even happening. Social change is for everyone and for anyone. Anyone who gets indignant about the way things are is meant to be an agent of social change. And I don't know anyone who is 100% okay with how things are. One of the things to really keep in mind is even if you don't feel it for yourself, sometimes what you feel for others is even more powerful, especially if it means giving a voice to those who do not have one. My most recent project, which is leading the development of an app for refugees and immigrants, is actually born from this feeling. I was working with refugees in the Middle East, and the unfairness of their everyday lives infuriated me. They were forced to make decisions like which kid were they going to save? They were faking weddings and funerals just to get past border. The lack of dignity granted to them would literally keep me awake at night. But when I started on this path to help them, I had this thought. Who did I think I was to help millions of people? I mean, I was some kid who rode the skate park in Whistler. These problems, border control and migration and refugees, these were for the really smart people in the world, and they were having a hard time with it. This is reserved for the Nelson Mandelas, the Noam Chomskys, the Margaret Thatchers, even the Oprah Winfreys, but not me. This mountain kid from Whistler. And here's the thing. We don't come up with these underestimations of ourselves on our own. Whenever someone asks me what I do and I say I'm an engineer, they go, oh, good for you. As though that surprise is acceptable. It just makes me feel like an other. Do you even belong if everyone is so surprised you do what you do and that you don't look or talk or act how they think you're supposed to? And that's often followed by the statement, oh, you must be a civil engineer. Now, I'm an electrical engineer. Oh, and by the way, if you ever hear of a bridge with my name on it, I suggest either like swimming or remaining on the one side. But because electrical is considered really mathematical and abstract, it seems too far out for like a first guess. And these reactions are systemic and systematic. They're enough to induce a feeling of being completely unwelcome, out of place, and completely out to lunch. So many of us in this room often have to figure out which part of us is being discriminated against. Is it because we're young? Is it because we're women? Is it because of the color of our skin? Is it because of how we're dressed? What exactly are we indignant about? Because there's just so many things. And then there's that question. Okay, what if I do speak out? What if I speak out and it fails to make a difference? Is there any point in me speaking out? Because every time I do, nothing seems to change. And then what if I speak out and I make a fool of myself? What if I get ridiculed? I'll look ridiculous. During my time in the Middle East, I was a human rights investigative journalist, and I was working on a number of stories. And the one that really, sat with me was this story that I was working on about Bangladeshi women. There's a collusion happening between a lot of the officials and domestic workers. So in the Middle East, a lot of the richer families would bring in domestic workers from countries such as Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, Ethiopia. Now, you had to normally be 25 years old to get a work permit to travel. A number of these girls were as young as 14 and 15, but officials were turning a blind eye and granting these young girls permits to go work as housekeepers in various countries in the Middle East. Now, because these girls were so poor, they would often end up selling cattle or taking on debt, sometimes even selling the family home just to afford the ticket to go there in hopes of being able to repay back that debt and then send money home to their families. And they would arrive in these countries, and their passports would be confiscated from them, and they would be enslaved by their employers. And there was no embassy for them to complain to. So for example, Bangladesh did not have an embassy in Lebanon. So there was no place for them to go to actually log a complaint. And because I looked like so many of them, and they had never seen someone who looked like them who was, not employed or not enslaved in this domestic work, they trusted me. So my job was to be undercover. And I was able to go into these enclaves and get the story from these women. And the stories that I came across are the kind that I hope that people learn about them. You can never be the same when you know this. These women who were very young, tortured, beaten, thrown from the third story of their home. They would send home, the employers would send out this idea that these girls were miserable and that they were unstable and that they'd committed suicide, when in fact they were getting pushed out of doors. And then we ran into this one girl, and she'd survived the fall. She actually fell onto a clothesline, and then she hung there. And then she dropped from there, and she broke her arm, but she was able to walk away. But they have no place to go, so they end up becoming prostitutes because they can't leave the country, and they can't find work doing anything else. So convincing these women to give me their story so that I could take the testimony and then bring it to tribunals and bring it to justice was hard enough, because they were so worried about endangering their lives and endangering their families back home. It took me many months to be able to gain their trust and to tell them that no, they were going to be safe and that I would get the story out. I promised that I would do my very best. So one day I was en route to meeting one of the girls who had promised to give me her testimony. And there was a lot of bombings. It was during the Syrian civil war, and I was literally on the border of Syria and Lebanon at the time. And there had been a lot of kidnappings of foreign journalists, and because I looked Indian and because of the nature of everything, I started to get a bit nervous. And then I found out that one of the routes had been bombed, and I spent the whole day in agony because I didn't know if I should go or if I should stay or if I should just fly home to Whistler but this person had entrusted me with something. And in the end, I decided not to go. I didn't go that day. And for days, months after that, I came home to Whistler, and I was like a shadow of my former self because I had failed to bring justice to those women. I was a coward when it counted. They were not cowards. I didn't tell their story. And the worst part was I was no longer who I thought I was. I was not someone who did whatever they could to bring justice and to tell other people's story. Instead, I was someone who failed when it really counted. And I had failed, and I had failed publicly. It was humiliating. It took me many months to understand that often speaking up and affecting change is actually punching above your weight class, or at least it can feel that way. But that this failure of having punched above your weight class and missing is actually one of the greatest gifts. Because we are truly the sum of our humiliations. We revisit them so much more than our triumphs, and they show us the depth of our character. Empathy isn't taught in a classroom. It is born from surviving complex, uncomfortable, and humiliating situations. And empathy is the genesis of any lasting social change. It is what we need to start and what we need to finish. So often, when you step into that light and you speak up, with that light comes heat. And you're going to have critics. Many people don't want the world to change because they benefit from how things are just perfectly right now. Privilege is often invisible to those who have it. But despite any critics, please never, ever, ever dilute yourself because it makes others uncomfortable. I see young women doing this and it drives me nuts, acting like imposters in their own realm, in their own skin. Don't refrain from speaking up because you fear looking unattractive. Young women, and sometimes not so young women, worry about how others are going to respond to their anger, and that angry, outspoken women are somehow unattractive. It's this idea of catering to the gaze of others, and oftentimes a male gaze. If you live for other people's approval, not only will that voice in you that wants to speak out get silenced, but the best parts of you go unexplored. And at worst case, you end up having a really boring life. But when what you're trying to do is create an atmosphere where people don't have to feel so much pain and so much insecurity, and you're incredibly uncomfortable with the inequality that exists, you're not going to be cool and chillax. Because being miffed at the way things are leads us to the courage to change them. And I actually remember once a friend of mine told me that anyone who wanted to date a girl without a pulse could just try dating in the morgue. This is not the time to retreat. I was so surprised to find out that less than 25% of the applicants for the astronaut program were women. It really struck me. This was the case, and it was 2017. So then I did some research. I asked peers, I asked colleagues, I asked their daughters. I was like, why? Why are people not aiming to be astronauts? Why is this happening? And the common theme that came back was that they didn't think that they would be very good at programming technology, computer programming. They were fine to use computers and interface and all of the social media, but when it actually came to programming the technologies, they felt like they just wouldn't be talented enough. The first algorithm you ever learn is long division. And I'm pretty sure a lot of people in here can do that just fine. And all programming is a bunch of algorithms. It's like learning a recipe. It's just baby steps. You just learn those building blocks just like you did long division, and that's how you learn to program. So if you can do long division, then you can learn to program. And if you can learn to program, then you can build the technologies of the future, and you can make lasting social change. And you don't need to be an astronaut or a scientist or programmer to make impact, as long as you show up in a way that feels genuine to you. There's so many ways to make change. That's just one. The important thing is when you do show up, how you show up. I once tackled a girl in junior high because she called me a packy. There was something about having my entire being reduced to my skin color that just like ignited my whole body. And in that moment, in my soccer gear and all, I like Supermaned across the locker room, throwing my whole body weight into this girl. And the moment I did it, I totally regretted it. Not just because I got my butt kicked, because I was a small kid and locker room fights, or like teeter-totters for that matter, didn't ever work in my favor. But it was also because as soon as I did that, I knew that wasn't how I was going to change anyone's mind. First, violence is never a solution, but I also realized if I was going to change people's mind, I had to be strategic about it. I figured if people were going to be staring at me and singling me out, I might as well give them something to stare at me for. So I realized I was going to have to overachieve so that people won't dismiss me. The best way to turn someone's bias around is not to tell them, but to show them that they're wrong. Ultimately, I grew into someone who was very unapologetic for being brown, but very aware of it and always trying to figure out how to navigate it, often here in Whistler. Growing up, I never met another Indian girl at the skate park. I never saw another one hitting dirt jumps. I never saw another one at multi-pitch climbing routes, and never on the Blackcomb halfpipe. In the early years, when I would show up in these environments, people would look at me like they'd seen a unicorn. The first time I ever saw myself on a poster for mountain culture, I even thought it looked out of place. Once there was a picture of me during a race at Crankworks, and it made it to a local mountain bike forum. And there was a comment there about how it looked like the person was wearing brown body armor. There was another comment following that said that, oh, it looked like I was missing my dot, and maybe that had been what was slowing me down. And, it was really indicative to me. Even in mountain culture, here in Whistler in the corridor, where we embody freedom and individual expression, it's still not free from racism. Now, on one hand, dominant Indian culture and a lot of traditional cultures actively discourage females from playing sports, especially sports that are seen as aggressive. I was literally considered a weirdo and out there and going down the wrong path for being a skateboarder and a biker and riding my skateboard to school every day and clambering up mountains and climbing rock faces. And I was really sandwiched between these two cultures, both which were telling me that there was something wrong with me for just being who I was. And I think that's a message we get a lot as females. But that struggle taught me two of my favorite lessons. And they are two lessons that have taken me through every situation that I've ever encountered. And the first one is, you must develop an invincible sense of self, no matter who you are. You will need to stand for something so that you do not just fall for anything. And sometimes you have to stand for things even if you stand alone. And my second one, and this is probably the most important one. If you take anything away from tonight, I hope you take this away. Do not be afraid to reject societal value if it is not conducive to your personal best. It is about staying connected to who you are in the presence of others. In other words, march to the beat of your own drum. Because your struggles are not a weakness or a disadvantage, nor are the biases that you encounter. It is okay to be the underdog. Boxing has this great analogy that I love, and it's that the champ is the one who's left standing after taking the most punches. Whatever your politics are, recent Canadian political landscape has had two underdogs make their way to victory, Jagmeet Singh and Justin Trudeau. And another great example is Serena Williams in sports. These people are not underdogs because of their abilities, but they are dismissed at the beginning of their pursuits. Too young, too flamboyant. Oh, your hair's too nice, your hair's not good enough. You have too much hair. A myriad of public perceptions that they have to overcome to get where they are. But all of them work hard at what they do. They are not deterred by their critics, and they own the values that they represent. All of these people, they're making change and they're a very public example, but you can make change on a much smaller scale and it will still count You don't have to do it in politics, and you don't have to do it in these large areas. And there's this, sometimes there's this notion that we look at people and we go, oh, but they're globalists and they're making this kind of change. Change happens in so many ways, and there's no prescribed ritual for it. The only thing that is required in every instance is taking action. Just because you don't think in a racist or sexist way doesn't make you non-racist or sexist. Just because you can be non-racist and non-sexist, but still benefit from a racist, sexist system. If you do nothing, you are complicit. So speaking up isn't just important, it is necessary, very necessary. Interestingly enough, if we don't start acting now, it turns out that the 940 billion English words that we are going to feed into artificial intelligence is going to have the gender and racial biases of today if we don't figure out a way to write corrections into it. So we really have our work cut out for us. Thing is, our world, it is changing. I remember a time when, nude foundation and flesh tone bandages meant a peachy tint. That's not the case anymore. But we can't just, think our way to what kind of change is possible. We need to feel our way there. And often what gets in our way to change, of realizing our threshold, realizing what we can do, our own potential individually, is impatience. Making change takes time and requires a huge dose of patience. Impatience, no matter what the era, is the shared language of youth. So I urge all the young people in this world of 30-second texts and social memes that, take 1 minute, to learn skills that require time and dedication. Because these are the things that are going to give you long-lasting rewards. And 2 of those things happen to be reading books and learning languages. These are the things that are going to equip you with knowledge and ideas on how to tackle a world that is changing really, really fast. They allow you to experience another person's reality and grasp how that intersects with your own. It allows for connections to stories that are actually beyond your own experience. And it's encouragement not just for who you are, but for who you want to become. Because you will become, no matter what age you are, the ideas that you interact with. In this world with, all of its problems, all of its issues, its continuum of information, all of its languages, don't worry if you haven't found that thing that grabs you. Don't worry if you haven't found your passion. It's okay. Just find things that you're curious about and follow them. Some of the greatest change makers were just people who saw things that were incongruent and those didn't sit right with them. If you look at Michelle Obama, First Lady, Malala Yousafzai, the teenage activist, or Angela Merkel, the leader of Germany, these are pretty everyday women, but who all understood that when good people do nothing, evil can triumph. They wouldn't have achieved anything great if they'd stayed silent in the face of difficult situations or were worried about fitting in. Because the truth is, maybe I don't fit in. I've been in enough situations to know that when I show up and people are expecting someone who looks like Steve Jobs or Lance Armstrong or Steven Spielberg, they just look right past me. So maybe I don't fit. But you young ladies in this audience, you will. Because of events like tonight, all of the organizers, your parents, the generations that went before you, your teachers, all of these people, they're assuring your place in the future. You will have a very real hand in molding a society where you are important, but one where everyone is important. By speaking up, other people's lives will be better because of the way that you lived yours. Because if not you, then who? Thank you.
with this image here because I want you all to think for a second. How do you feel? What are some of the thoughts that cross your mind when you look at this? Do you see someone who is lost? Maybe they're wandering. Maybe they're a little overwhelmed. Or do you see someone who is walking with purpose, walking to face whatever challenges may come her way? And whatever you're feeling or whatever is crossing your mind right now is okay. I just want you to acknowledge it and sit with it a little bit because we're going to revisit this image later on. And for me, I've been on both sides of that coin. I've been at a place where I did feel lonely and overwhelmed, and a place now where I'm able to speak on stage. And it's not to say that I'm 100% confident. I still feel the little jitters and little public speaking jitters, but I want to use this time to talk a little bit about my journey. And to do so, I want to take you back 10 years, a decade ago, back to elementary school. And for those of you who may be in elementary school right now, or may have fond experiences of your time in elementary school, you may remember it as a time of fun, a time of friends, a time of belonging, a time where your hardest class was maybe social studies or science or PE. Maybe you liked to do art or music, or maybe like me, your favorite course was lunch and recess. But whatever it may be, that was the case for me as well. That is up until I was in grade 5. And now in grade 5, some interesting things started to happen. I noticed that some people started to say very interesting things about who they presumed me to be, things that were not kind. And I wondered what was going on. And at first I thought, you know what, Vivian, you can't expect everyone to be your friend. You can't expect everyone to like you, and so I started to hang out with different crowds. I went to play with people who played soccer on the field at lunch. I hung out with people who played cards undercover, and I hung out with people who preferred to stay inside, maybe reading a book or drawing during lunch. And it was all fun until the pattern started repeating itself again. And I was wondering, what is going on? And I didn't really know what to do. Until a parent actually was the one to speak to me. And that was when I discovered that someone had hacked into my email account and had used it to send out malicious emails to everyone in the class. And that's why the pattern kept on repeating. Whatever new group I hung out with, they would just send those emails, and then overnight, I would lose my friends once again. And to this day, I still don't know why they did that or who did it. But at that time, I felt overwhelmed, alone, and very much an outsider. And for those of you who may be familiar with the Wi-Fi and technology of today's time, back 10 years ago, that wasn't really the case. We didn't really have Wi-Fi available everywhere. I remember I still had to plug in a cord, some of you might remember, called an Ethernet cable into the wall to access internet. And at that time, I didn't even know how to change my password for the longest time. And when I finally did, it was a little late because I started receiving emails back from the people who received emails sent from my account. Emails filled with name calling, hate mail, and rumors that were not true and were just presumptions that they had of who I was. And slowly I decided to just retreat within myself. I didn't know who to turn to. Back at the time, there were no anti-bullying campaigns. There wasn't really Pink Shirt Day very much, and we didn't have workshops or classes at school to tell us that we should be kind and to encourage people to step up and speak up for people who didn't have a voice. And so at that time, I just poured myself into my studies, actually, as a coping mechanism. I thought that maybe if I was good at one thing, that could be my identity, and that could be who I was. And even though that gave me a smidgen of confidence, I eventually realized that I lost a lot of who I was in the process. And it wasn't until I got into high school that I actually decided that, you know what, this is not all there is to life, and this is not all there is to who I was. And so I had these 3 almost strategies and little pearls of wisdom that I accumulated over the years that helped me to find who I was. And the first of them is reflection. Reflection on what really am I passionate about? Who am I? What are my interests? What change do I want to make in the future? What are my goals and my dreams? And I would encourage all of you to take a moment and think about that. Might you be using something in your life as a coping mechanism, or maybe as an identity marker? And what are you really interested in? Who are you really? And what kind of change do you want to make? The second is reassessment. And so I had a very good high school counselor who actually gave me this quote, that we are the average of our 5 closest friends. And at first, I was a little perplexed. I was like, do you want me to distill my friends list down to just 5, or do you want me to do some math so I can figure this out? And in reality, I was relieved to find out that this was really not the case. And all this quote is reminding us of is that we should be conscious and aware of who we are surrounding ourselves with, and to choose to surround ourselves with friends and with people who support us, who speak positively into our lives, and people who believe in us, not only who we have the potential to be in the future, but who we are today. And throughout high school, I was very privileged to be able to meet some of these people who are still some of my good friends today, who know about my story and who are encouraging of the steps I'm taking. The third is resilience. And now resilience used to sound really foreign to me, kind of like a word that, those of you who have wordly wise quizzes or vocabulary quizzes at the end of the week, kind of a word that you would try and spell. And I didn't really know what it meant, except all resilience is the ability to bounce back after a struggle or after a sticky situation. And for me, it was the acknowledgement that resilience is something that you choose for yourself. It's not something that anyone can take away. And for me, that was incredibly empowering. And so it was these 3 things, of reflection, reassessment, and resilience, that allowed me to speak positively within myself, and consequentially allowed me to speak up. And now speaking up, all it is to say something instead of being too afraid to say anything. And for me, it didn't even start with words, but rather with actions. And at that time, I was in grade 9. I thought to myself, what can I do as a grade 9 student? I was barely 15. I was just an individual person, and I thought, how can I make change? And I really went back to how I felt in elementary school, and I decided to eat lunch with people who didn't have anyone to eat lunch with. I started small, just in my school, and then I branched out to a life skills class, which was a class with students with developmental and behavioral disabilities at my school, and then eventually branched out to my city. And I come from Vancouver, and you might be thinking, who are the people in Vancouver that don't have anyone to eat lunch with? And really, this population is the homeless community in Vancouver's downtown east side. And I decided that I would just go and bring a meal with me because they didn't really have any means to get their own meal. And I would sit down for an hour, sometimes more, and just chat with them. And through that process, I realized that who people appear on the outside doesn't necessarily align with who they are really on the inside. And throughout that process, I met wonderful people. Some people who were themselves bullied in the past, and some people who simply believed in the vision and the impact that we can have simply by eating lunch with people. And that was really where we started. And with them, I created something called the Hope Initiative. And the Hope Initiative is all about empowerment, because it's in our name. The Hope Initiative, and HOPE stands for the Humanitarian Organization for Providing Empowerment. And that's what we do. We empower, first of all, student leaders, you all here. Secondly, we empower school communities, and then we empower our city and beyond. And again, we start small. We started with acts of kindness. We did things like baking cookies for people after school and handing it out. We did things like writing words of affirmation on little sticky notes and sticking it on people's lockers at school. We wrote notes of thank you for janitorial staff and our teachers. And I'm saying this because this is something that maybe you can all think of. Perhaps you can think of something small that you can do in your schools or in your workplaces to make a little bit of change. And as we built and grew in numbers and in experience, we were able to host bigger events, things like workshops and conferences, such as this one here, where we hosted a women's career conference. free of charge for girls in our community, many of which who come from inner city schools that didn't really have very much support. And they came and we invited speakers from different career fields to come and talk about how they went from point A to point B. Point A being where we were as high school students, and then point B being where they were successfully achieving in their careers. And with that, with speaking up in all of those areas, prompted me to speak out. And when I thought about speaking out, I always think about something like this, where there'd be large crowds and posters and signs and rallies, and that was a little bit intimidating for me. And so I decided to Google it. And all speaking out is, which to my relief, is just to speak boldly about an issue and to express an opinion frankly. And for me, that issue was STEM. Because when I hosted these conferences, I noticed that a lot of girls had an interest in STEM, which is science, technology, engineering, and math. Predominantly male-dominated fields. And for those of the girls who came from more traditional households or conservative families, that really wasn't a field that they were encouraged to go in, as Anita mentioned in her talk. And so for me, this was an area that I personally loved. And thanks to a lot of mentors who spoke into my life, I didn't have troubles pursuing it. But I knew that I could make change. As I dug deeper into the issue, I realized that a lot of women in the field also face something called the imposter syndrome. And you might be familiar with the imposter syndrome, but it really is just the inability to internalize one's achievements and successes, rather kind of brushing it off as, oh, it's due to chance, or I just got lucky. And this affected women in different ways. It affected their ability to speak up about their achievements. It affected their ability to ask for help. And I knew that something had to be done. And so with this image here, you can actually see that it represents the incongruencies that ran through a lot of women's minds as they thought about what they know, what they think they know, and what they think other people know, versus in reality when the situation was very much different. And so I joined this organization called Women in Science. And this is a national organization that operates in different universities and high schools all around Canada. And we host things like Meet a Mentor events. I even brought this to Hope, and with Hope, we run this program called Hope for Success, where we actually match up 300 high school students in their graduating year with a university mentor or someone in the field of their choosing. And throughout a year-long process, we help them with things like university applications, thinking about whether post-secondary is an option, and even managing the stresses of the transition. For me, I noticed that a lot of students, when they entered post-secondary, they had struggles finding who they are and balancing the workload along of many other of life's struggles. And so this is what Hope does. And we work from October of one year all the way till October and beyond of the next year, so that there's continuity in what we do. And throughout all of these projects and programs and activities, I reminded myself of the initial 3 points of reflection, reassessment, and resilience that brought me understanding and clarity about who I was. And whenever I faced a sticky situation or an area where I really struggled and I didn't really know what to do, I reminded myself that I had the tools to overcome whatever barriers I faced. And so that brings me to where I am now, where I'm able to speak with a purpose to empower, and a purpose to remind young people that their voice matters, that doing small acts of kindness really can make a big difference. And a purpose to remind all of you that no matter what kind of life circumstances you come from or whatever situation you may be in, that you can use that as a catalyst and a force for change. And so I was lucky that I have been given platforms such as TEDx and We Day, and most recently at the Canada 150 celebrations, to share. And not just to share my successes, but to share my story of how I came from a place of loneliness, a place where I felt overwhelmed, a place where I didn't know what to do, to a place now where I'm able to speak up, to speak out, and to speak with a purpose. And my story is just one story of how healing can happen and how the cycle of brokenness can be broken over time. And so here we are. We're back to this image. And 15, 20 minutes later, did anything change in your perception of this image? And the reason I love this exercise is because I think that this and how we see and how we choose to see this image perhaps says more about how we see the world and the situations that happen around us than what the image is actually depicting. And this is a powerful example of how our perception can shape our thought patterns and our actions. And so I just want to use this time to give a small reminder to those of you who may be feeling like you're in a place of loneliness, where you're feeling, maybe overwhelmed or a little lost, that what you see right now is not what all life has to offer. And that when you reach for help, there is help available to you. And a reminder to use the 3 things that perhaps I used: of reflection, of reassessment, and to remind yourself that you can choose to be resilient. And with that, I hope that you'll all feel a little bit more inspired and empowered to speak up, to speak out, and to speak with a purpose. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. Thank you all for coming out and being here today and showing your support. It's really amazing. I remember clearly the moment I decided to change my name. My mom and I were in the car, and we were trying on names, and she asked me, okay, well, what about Raven? No. Tracy? Too bland. Sarah? Okay. I wanted a name that was unique. Tracy just didn't seem like a name that fit me. Okay, well, what about True? Now, keep in mind the movie Mirror Mirror had just come out, and I was obsessed with having 2 names like protagonist Snow White. So, in turn, I said, what about True Heart? And my mom, without hesitating, told me, no, you sound like a cartoon. Fine, I'll go with Tracy. A year later, I realized that Tracy didn't fit either. The name that truly fit me was True. True represents me living by my truth always, and that has defined my life and who I am ever since. If you can't tell, I was born a boy. But as you can clearly see, I am a girl. I'd always been different as a child, believe me. I was the boy who played with dolls and dressed up as a princess for playtime. So naturally, my parents were a bit concerned when they heard me ask for a princess-themed birthday party. They went to my teacher, and the teacher told them not to worry. It's natural for kids to try out different things when they're young to find out what they like. Eventually, he'll start drifting towards the boys' side of the playroom. Well, clearly that didn't happen. After years of dress up and pretending to have long hair, of calling myself a girly boy and asking to wear the girl's uniform, my mom found a documentary on trans youth and decided to show it to me. And I've never related to a documentary more in my life. Everything that the kids were saying, everything that they were doing, I related to entirely. There's one girl, and she talked about how she felt before her transition, how her name didn't feel right, how she felt as though she was put in the wrong body. And the whole time I was just thinking, I'm feeling all those things right now. And when the film was done, I broke down crying. I have finally found the words to describe how I was feeling, who I was. I told my parents, that's me. I'm transgender. Immediately, my mom took me to the store and got me my first girl wardrobe. Dresses, skirts, shirts, the whole shebang. And it was all pink and purple to show that I was really girly. This all happened at the end of the school year. And my counselor suggested that we take the summer and just let me be me. So, with the help of my parents, we created the Summer of Trey. That's my birth name. A summer where I'm free to express my truest self. at home, at dance, at basketball. I was living as the girl I knew I truly was. I think the highlight of my summer would have to be when my dad took me to see the Katy Perry movie, which was fitting because the movie talked about being yourself and not letting anyone change who you are. My dad bumped into one of his clients at the movie theater. His client said, "Oh, it's so nice of you to take your daughter to see the movie theater." I waited for my dad to correct him. Do you know what he said? "Yeah, it is." He didn't correct him. It felt amazing. I was finally starting to feel like I was truly accepted. I expected to go back to school and it'd be exactly the same. I was gonna walk through those doors as the girl I knew I truly was. But that didn't happen. When I was in grade 2, my family transferred us to a semi-private Catholic school. And everyone in my class, even my teachers, thought I was gay. And I don't blame them. I drew princesses, I drew fairies and mermaids in my free time. All my friends were girls, and I acted like a girl. But when they heard that I wanted to transition and start living my life as a girl, that they couldn't handle that. They handed my parents a letter from their lawyer saying that they can support a trans child in their transition. But we wanted to make it work with the school, so we jumped through their hoops. Excuse me. We handed them letter after letter after letter of recommendations from doctors and psychiatrists saying that it was a good decision to let me transition. But school wouldn't budge. During that time, I felt like an outcast. All my friends were on the girls' side of the classroom while I was stuck on the boys. They didn't trust me in the girls' bathroom, and I didn't feel comfortable in the boys. So I was put in the handicap bathroom. I was being put in the safe zone. I had always felt different, but this really confirmed it. My classmates and teachers looked at me differently, as if I was a dangerous animal that they needed to be careful around. They put together sentences carefully, as if one word could set me off. They talked to me in this tone, as if I could explode at any moment. It was torture, sitting at the back of the field, daydreaming about walking through those doors as the girl I knew I truly was, and crying. Crying because I was starting to believe that it would never happen. My parents saw that I was suffering, so we left. I went back to my old public elementary school. I had to say goodbye to all the friends that I had made at that school, some of which I didn't even get to say goodbye to because their parents didn't want them to be affected by a trans child. I got so many goodbye letters, and I didn't open a single one because I was afraid that if I did, I'd truly be saying goodbye, and I didn't want to do that. My parents set up a meeting with the principal at our new school to tell her our story. And when we finished, she started crying. "Yes, yes, whatever you need. We're here to support you." When I heard that this school was going to let me use the girls' bathroom, I almost started crying myself. We finally found a community that accepted us, that accepted me. And it was amazing. When I didn't go to school the next day, I asked my parents why. And they told me that the school needed time to prepare. They needed to bring in specialists to talk about my needs from the school and what they needed to do in order to make me feel welcome. And to 9-year-old True Wilson, that sounded like I was this upper class princess that they needed to prepare for my greatness. When that was definitely not the case. But it sounded nice to me. It was my first day at my new school. My first day being the real me at school. And I was nervous. And a girl who dressed in all black, had dark hair, and looked like the kind of girl who nobody wanted to mess with, approached me. And instead of saying something mean or telling me how I was pretending to be a girl, she introduced herself and invited me to hang out with her at recess. Since then, we've been soul sisters. She's never once questioned who I am, never once doubted my gender. She has made me so much stronger. She's been a huge part of my life. And I couldn't ask for a better sister, except for the one that's right there. I truly love her. Not long ago, we were moving, and I had to clean out under my bed. And I found a folder that I didn't recognize, so I pulled it out. I opened the folder, and there lay all the goodbye letters from my friends back at the Catholic school. It took me a moment to breathe before I read them. All of the sadness and hurt that I had balled up inside me was finally let out. It felt like a giant weight was lifted off of my shoulders. I had unintentionally been holding back so many tears, and it felt so good to finally let them out. Not long after we got settled into our new school, my parents and I decided to file a human rights complaint against the Catholic School Board of Vancouver because we didn't want any other child to have to go through what I went through. And after 2 years of talks, we won. We got a policy made that supports gender expression and identity. But believe me, it is a far from perfect policy. We still witness families having trouble with it today, but at least it's a start. Since then, I realized that there are so many other kids out there like me who are having to pretend to be someone they're not in order to please others. So I become an advocate. And I go around and I speak to people about what it's like to be trans and how to help trans youth and how to be yourself. I have never stopped living my truth, and that's where I get my power from. My friends, family, and community accept my truth and love me for it, unconditionally. And look what happened. I'm a living example of what can happen when you learn to love and accept yourself, your true self, no matter who you are. And if we can accept other people for their truth, think of the endless possibilities. So who are you? What is your truth? And how can you live it? Thank you.